I want to briefly, and I may not get to it tonight, but I want to briefly, last statement, there was no room for them in the inn. I had been in plays when I was 3 years old. There was no room in the inn. One of the first memories I have of a Christmas pageant was that Dad preached in the afternoon in one of his 3 churches that he was pastoring, and he preached on Sunday afternoon in Broadbrook, Virginia, and on the way back we were practicing the play that I was going to be in, and I was to sing Away in the Manger. And I was about 8 years old, or I can't remember exactly how old I was. And I remember practicing that on the way, and I couldn't wait to get back to be in that Christmas program. There was no room for them in the inn. And it's become a very familiar part of the Christian lore. And it really is not a legend. It is, in fact, as the text indicated, we've all seen no vacancy signs posted outside motels, and sometimes, I suppose, we've seen no vacancy signs when we didn't want to see them. And there was a certain level of desperation that was very late. The kids were in need of a place to sleep, and my temper was about raging, and I was real irritated at 4 kids in the car and a cranky husband and a cranky wife. And when we'd pull up and it was pouring down the rain and they said no vacancy, I was sometime to fit to be time. No vacancy. Well, there's a sermon right there, isn't it? A sign spelled for us a very serious potential situation. Well, as far as Joseph and Mary were concerned, their circumstances made the no vacancy sign in Bethlehem all the more serious because Mary was about to deliver a baby. This young couple, Joseph probably 14 or 15, and I was telling Charity this week, I only found one picture of a man who didn't have a beard. Now, maybe in those days a person 15 years old had a beard. I'm not sure. But every depiction of Joseph that I've seen, he always has a beard, indicating that he was up in his 20s or 30s or however old you have a beard. I don't know. And Joseph probably, from what we understand, 14 or 15, and Mary probably 13 or 14 years of age. The two of them had journeyed about 85 miles from their home in Nazareth. And as they went through the land, as they traveled these 80 miles, and I'll say more about it later, they literally had been filled with memories, which they would have because they knew the Old Testament history, and they knew Old Testament stories. They more than likely entered Shiloh would greet them, where Hannah came to pray for the child before the Lord. And there the angel Gabriel at Gilgal, where his son Samuel sat to judge Israel. And they may have passed through the valley of Baca, which is the psalmist sung, and the road perhaps would wind past Bethel with all of its patriotic memories, and Ramah was where Jeremiah pictured Rachel weeping for her children. And they would climb up the little bit to Gideon, where Solomon worshiped, and finally they would come to a great metropolis of Jerusalem, and passing through Jerusalem would go up to Mount Merid by the hill of Zion, across the top of that mountain, that plateau on Jerusalem. And about 6 miles further on their trip, they would come to a village called Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, perhaps the town of Ruth and Boaz, Bethlehem, the place where Jacob's first love, Rachel, died and was buried, and even the tax driver would point out, this is the place of Rachel's tomb. But Bethlehem was most notably the town where David was born. David, the great king of Israel had ever known. And as they came to this place, these memories took place. When Charity and I take trips, when we came back from Kansas to here, this is the place where Abraham Lincoln lived. This is the home of so-and-so. And so as we travel from one place to another place, there's always signs that says historically this is what happened right here. And so as they traveled, I'm sure they began to think, wow, this is remarkable. We're in a land where our ancestors lived. And when they came to Bethlehem, it says in verse 7, there was no room for them. 9 months pregnant, in a matter of a few days to deliver a baby, and no place to stay. Apparently no relatives awaited them in a warm home. It was late fall or early winter, as some say. Nobody to care for this little couple, no room for them. And that notes certainly the symbolic of the future for Jesus. It seems to me that as far as Jesus is concerned, there still is no vacancy sign hanging over the world. The world has no time and no place for Jesus to stay in their lives. But before we look, however, at the young couple, let me go back to the text a little, because there's so much more here than we need to understand. Let me review briefly, otherwise listen to the tapes. Now, when you come to Luke chapter 2, the prophecy has come to pass. 9 months have passed since Gabriel announced the birth of Jesus. And Mary is in full term, and she is, in this passage, gives birth to baby Jesus. And now Luke tells us the story of the birth, which is very simple, told at the beginning of verse 7. And here's what Luke says. And she gave birth. And that's all there is. That's all it says. So how can you get so much out of that? Just wait. Another one of those classic understatements. And she gave birth. It was like any other and every other birth. The child was not like any other child. The birth was like every other birth, and we're going to look at it in a moment. But Luke, wanting us to grasp that significance of what's going on, provides for us, as a good historian does, a setting of this event. The event in verse 7, she gave birth. The setting is what enriches it and informs it. And he works his way down, starts with the world setting, and then a national setting, and then a personal setting. He gives 3 settings to set the stage for the coming of Jesus. There's a purpose for that. First, we learned last week that the role of a larger world played in this. How did the world itself play into the coming of Jesus? Then the world that is uniquely designed by God for the nation Israel. And then a particular circumstances of the couple in Bethlehem and the birth of the baby. First of all, the world setting. And I give it to you last week, and we just mentioned it here in verses 1 through 3. What we learned, it is amazing how God orchestrated everything to provide the means for the birth of Jesus. It just didn't happen. Everything happened on purpose. Whether he is willing or unwilling subject, whether a part of God bringing together the details and all of the components of the birth of Messiah, the right time, the right place, was to move on the minds of the pagan, godless Caesar, who knew nothing about the Old Testament, nothing about the coming of this Messiah, nothing about God whatsoever. He was in every sense a pagan, and he yet played a most critical role in the fulfillment of the prophecy at the birth of God-man, the Messiah, Jesus Christ, and it was because he made a decree. He just so happened, out of a clear blue sky, made a decree that affected the birth of Jesus, to get Jesus exactly where he needed to be to fulfill the prophecy that was told in Micah chapter 5 and verse 2. And his name was Caesar Augustus. As we learned last week, that really wasn't his name. That's how we know him in the New Testament. His actual name was Augustus Octavius, I mean. He was known as Octavius. That was his given name. Caesar is like a king, an emperor, Pharaoh. And so we discussed that last time. He was brilliant. He was formidable ruler. And God placed him, this wicked ruler, placed him, yet he was brilliant, and he brought about one thing that was necessary to have peace. And he brought about peace, he brought about roads, the Roman roads, so it enabled Joseph to travel 90 miles from Nazareth to Jerusalem to Bethlehem without any fear of getting mugged with a pregnant wife on a donkey. Caesar Augustus provided the means where they could do that. This one who was a false savior of the world knew absolutely nothing about the birth of the true Savior of the world. But in the natural, normal course of his rule, he determined that a census needed to be taken in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was vast, and he had census basically for taxation. That's the same reason we have census today in our own country, to identify all the citizens so they can be taxed. It hadn't changed in 2,000 years, has it? And that's exactly what was happening in that day. He wanted a tax to fulfill to full extent of his Roman Empire, because he was providing services for all of those nations which he become vast to the great power of Rome. And since the United States has 50 states to deal with, there has to be taxation. Amazing. One man in the ivory palace of Rome given a command, and the whole world responded. It may well be that up to that point there had never been a man with the power over more lives than Caesar Augustus. And when Caesar Augustus said to do something, they did it. It may never have got done in the United States, because if the president says something, there would have been a stalemate for 4 years. There was no time to waste. A decree went out and it had to be done, and there was no debate, as we saw that last time. Caesar didn't know anything about it. Herod didn't know anything about the purpose and the plan of God. But God was working all the details on a world setting. From Caesar's standpoint, he didn't understand any of this. In verse 3, everybody had to register for the census, and it says everyone in his own city. What's interesting is that Rome did not stipulate that you had to go to your own city. It wasn't a Rome rule. The Rome would have been happy for people to register in the town they lived in. Well, so it is most likely that the fact that they went back to the city of their ancestries, that there was a Jewish stipulation, either by Herod or by some stipulation. So it most likely was a Jewish prescription. The Jews decided that everybody should go back to a place where their records were kept. So remember, when the children of Israel came out of the land of Canaan, the whole land was divided into sections, and tribes were given sections, and when they went back, they had to go back to the city and register where they were. And that was all very, very critical of the purpose of God. For you see, the Bible says that Joseph and Mary would go back to Bethlehem. And you see, Joseph and Mary was 90 miles away from Bethlehem. And why else would Joseph bring his wife 90 miles pregnant if he could rest her in his own hometown? Had Caesar Augustus made his decree earlier or later, had Herod resisted shorter or longer, the child would have been born in Nazareth and not have fulfilled prophecy, and we could conclude that God couldn't control circumstances. There was just a little window open to fulfill the prophecy of Micah chapter 5 and verse 2.